Okay, we'll make a start. We will make a start. Welcome back. Thank you for coming back. Always an encouragement when the afternoon is not much smaller than the morning. And we're into our third session. Just as a reminder, we've looked at the original purpose, the overall purpose and strategy of Hebrews. That was the first session. Consider Jesus is what we need to do. Why do we need to do that? For you have need of endurance. So consider Jesus, for you have need of endurance. What are we supposed to consider about Jesus? That he's greater. And how is he greater? Well, he's greater than all that's come before as the Son. The Son is greater than all the servants who came before. What does Son mean? Well, he's the divine Son and the Davidic Son, as in he's the eternal God, God the Son, and he's the appointed King, the King on the throne of David, the Psalm 110 King. And where is the Son right now? At God's right hand, as in there is no voice above the Son, ultimate authority. And as we're going to see this afternoon, as the Son at God's right hand, he's also the priest for us. Just before we get into this material on page, whatever page we're on, hang on, let me get my what page are we on for session 3? Excellent, you know, even if not me. Just go back a page, though, to the one that starts, so what for us? Question 5, so what for us? I forgot to say this at the end. Here we go, I've got the right sheet now. I forgot to say this at the end of our session, but as we were saying all morning, two major applications. One is early in the book. One is listening to him, because he's so far above us. And there's some questions there to kind of get the juices flowing, sorts of things we might use in application or in hooks for talks. So how would you respond if an angel appeared with a message? Wouldn't it be amazing to meet Isaiah, etc.? And then the Son's bigger. And then the stuff down the bottom, that was applying the way he, as our older brother, not ashamed to be called our older brother. Jesus came across the playground because we were in trouble, came down below the angels to rescue us. And again, some things to reflect on there. So that was where we ended last time. But now, on to page 13 and session 3. And we're getting now to the heart of the book. And this heart of the book may be the bit we're initially a little less excited about, or at least the bit we're a bit kind of daunted by. Sadly, one of the less encouraging comments we got when going through Hebrews from a small group leader was, doesn't it all just say the same thing in the middle bit? We're going to give a few months to chapters 5 to 10, and he was like, isn't it just Jesus is the priest, Jesus is the priest, Jesus is the priest? Like that, we kind of already know that. It's just going to be same old, same old. Hopefully in this session we'll realise there's a bit more to it than that. But that might be what lots of folk are feeling around our churches. So it's good to think, how do we help with that sort of feeling? In terms of the plan, so you'll see we've got a few things to do in this session. First I'm going to say a brief thing about structure. What better way to wake up after lunch than to hear a structural sidebar? And then, if that doesn't put you to sleep, do we really need to know about Melchizedek? We'll get straight into Melchizedek. Then, how was the Son appointed as priest? And what's so special about being a Melchizedek-like priest? And then we'll get to implications for us at the end. Good, okay. So into the structure. And this is particularly, I'm conscious, not least from the survey earlier, we were a real range of people in the room, which is wonderful. Some of us newly Christian, some of us teaching in churches regularly. And so for those who are teaching, this structure stuff might be really helpful. For those who aren't particularly interested in it, that's fine. Just keep digesting your lunch, and it won't take too long. So question 1, is there any structure in Hebrews? Now, it's worth saying it is hard to work out a structure in Hebrews. It's confusing and puzzling. Interestingly, not because of a lack of potential structural markers. You know, authors can put in phrases or kind of key terms or linking words that kind of make you think, oh, that's key, that's important, that's That's kind of structural. It's not that there's too few of those, it's almost that there's too many of those. One commentator said that. There's just so many structural markers, you can kind of feel like there's loads of jigsaw pieces and I'm not quite sure how to put them together. Like trying to nail spaghetti to the wall. You've just got one bit and then there's this other bit and there's this, etc. I've never tried that. I wasn't allowed when I was asking this week if I could do some experiments. But apparently that's what it's like if you nail spaghetti to walls. What are some of the clues that I think create confusion? So what are some of the things the author does that makes it hard to work out the structure? Here are a few of them. Idea leakage. So someone like Paul, writing Romans, has very discrete blocks, as in he's on a unit and he's just talking about one thing, and then when you finish that thing, you've got a question, and he like raises the question, and then he answers that next question, and then he's got another question. Very discrete units. That means bite-sized ideas, nicely kind of hermetically sealed together. Hebrews isn't like that because ideas leak into other sections. So we saw that this morning. The first bit of the book, 1:1 to 3:6, is really mostly about the speech of the Son. Remember the top trumps? He's a better speaker, greater speaker than prophets and angels and Moses. But there was that bit in the middle about the older brother. He was the willing pioneer who came down to step into our shoes. It kind of overlaps. It's not neat, like all the speech stuff, then the brother stuff, then the priest stuff. It overlaps. The ideas leak. Does that make sense? And actually, those of you, this is a tip if you haven't done this in Cornhill yet, those of you who are going to do a talk on that passage, and we'll come across, in fact, one of our apprentices at Chalmers is doing this, chapter 2, verse 17. Chapter 2, verse 17. 2 verse 17, therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. So hang on, that's the priest stuff. I've got to talk about priests now. And you can imagine the talk that you've just done 25 minutes on he's the older brother who came in to rescue us from death, and then you're like, but he's also the priest. Let me give you another 20 minutes on he's the priest, and what kind of priest is he, and how does he offer propitiation? Now, what that is not telling you that chunk is about his priesthood. It's a trailer, or a hook phrase. It's a trailer of what's coming next. This idea leakage, that's what it's actually going on. He trailers the idea he's going to talk about next. That makes sense? So you get a comment, and we had it in 1 to 4 as well. Just look at verse 3 of chapter 1. Jesus the Son is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. That after making purification for sins, like how are sins purified, that's the topic of chapters 8 to 10, but it's being trailered here. Does that make sense? Like lots of little clips telling you bits of the book that are coming later. And the reason why we need to know that's his style is the risk is you try and teach everything whenever it pops up. So he says, priest, I need to really explain that. Purification from sins, I need to do a little sidebar on that, 5 minutes on how he's the one-off sacrifice that purifies everything. Now, it's a judgment call. You might say, actually, I need to say something on that, but my advice would be let the book unpack the ideas when the book unpacks them, and when the book trailers them, just trailer them. Does that make sense? Trust that the Holy Spirit is a good pastor, will explain it in good time, and therefore kind of flag, but don't kind of do a whole talk about those issues. But all of that does make it hard to discern structure because it feels like, I've heard that idea here and that idea here, that idea. Now I'm going to say a couple more things about structure and then we'll pray and properly get into our material. On this page 13, there's a few of the ways it's often done. And there are just loads of different views out there of how to put it together. Some focus on the kind of theology, and particularly the theology about Christ, the Christology. So there's a guy called Albert Van Hoy. He's got some great stuff on how Psalm 110 and Hebrews relates. And he says the basic point of Hebrews is everyone knows that Jesus is the Psalm 110 verse 1 guy, as in across the New Testament and across the early church. Everyone knows he's the king, sat at God's right hand. But what Hebrews is telling you is the king at God's right hand is your priest. Your priest. He's the priest. The king is the priest. And that's helpful as we'll see, there's a lot about the king early on, his authority, and there's a lot about the priest in the middle. But he doesn't really do much with the warnings and the exhortations, all the kind of keep going stuff. So there's not much about that. Another approach people have is to focus entirely on the warnings. So just turn to chapter 13, verse 22. Chapter 13, verse 22. So this is the approach that focuses on the exhortations. And when coming from this approach, there's a bit of good evidence, because verse 22, end of the book of chapter 13, says, I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation, for I've written to you briefly. And I think, that's it. He's telling us what it is. It's a word of exhortation. It's a sermon, a word of exhortation. And so maybe the key to really getting Hebrews is just to focus on the commands, the do's and the don'ts, and the exhortations. And so people coming from this perspective would make a big deal of that wilderness stuff that I told you, that fork in the road. Don't fall from unbelief. Do keep living by faith. That's really important. Does that make sense? That's one approach. A different approach is next on the sheet, this idea that the way Hebrews is structured is through major passages that are being expounded. So if you like, Hebrews like a talk series where he has like a major passage and then he explains it, and then another major passage and he expounds it, and then another major passage and then he expounds it. And that's how I got into looking at Hebrews, its use of the Old Testament, because there is a lot of that goes on. Or in other words, did the author of Hebrews do Cornhill? It seems like it. Or maybe Cornhill's doing what the New Testament does. I hope. So here are some examples. Psalm 110 verse 1 is the key text for 1:1 to 2:4. It's obviously quoted in verse 13, but it's alluded to at the start of the list in verse 3. So verse 3, verse 13, 3 and 13, topping and tailing the list of Old Testament quotes, Psalm 110, that's the big text. Psalm 8, that you can see quoted in chapter 2, verses 6 to 8, is the key passage for all that brother stuff, that Jesus came below the angels, stepped into human shoes. Then Psalm 95, that's the today if you hear his voice, chapter 3, verse 7 onwards. Today if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. That's key for all the wilderness stuff of chapters 3 and 4. Now Psalm 110 verse 4, if you look at chapter 5 verse 6, Psalm 110 verse 4, in chapter 5 verse 6, he says in another place, this is Psalm 110 verse 4, you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So that kind of dominates chapters 5 to 7 from that point onwards. That's the key text for that. If you turn on to chapter 8, verse 8, he quotes from Jeremiah 31, a big passage about the new covenant, Jeremiah 31. So 8 verse 8, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I'll establish a new covenant with the house of Israel. And if you look at verse 12, the end of that quotation is, for I'll be merciful towards their iniquities and I'll remember their sins no more. That begins that new section about the new covenant. And the end of that section, chapter 10, verse 16, recaps Jeremiah 31. So 10:16, this is the covenant I'll make with them, this new covenant. And verse 17, I'll remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. Does that make sense? So Jeremiah 31 dominates chapters 8 to 10. And you could go on and on and on. You know that bit about by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith, that we always start our series at 11 verse 1. Have you done that? I've done that. Start at 11 verse 1. We'll have a look at 10 verse 37. This is slightly awkward, a bit embarrassing. 10 verse 37. Habakkuk 2, 3 to 4. Yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul will have no pleasure in him. We're not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and preserve their souls by faith. Now faith is the assurance of ... So actually, if we've been preaching the series on Hebrews 11 without the end of chapter 10, we've been missing the reading before we do the sermon. Does that make sense? Like the reading is Habakkuk 2, and then the chapter is unpacking how have the righteous lived by faith through the history of the Old Testament. So that's another example. And then Proverbs 3 in 12, we won't look at that. So that, in lots of ways, has got a lot going for it, doesn't it? Like, as you read through Hebrews, you do think, oh, in different bits, there's a passage that seems to be like the major passage for this chunk. And if you can get your heads around what is the major passage, like what are we thinking about at the moment? We're thinking about Psalm 95. Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. We're thinking about the new covenant, Jeremiah 31. Okay, it's all about the new covenant and the forgiveness. That really helps. But here's the thing, and this is my green box down at the bottom. Oh, no, it's not green. It's got pink arrows. Amazingly, they just went pink when it turned into a PDF. I don't know why. Mine has green. But anyway, the big thing to realize on this whole kind of what is his text, like what's he expounding? If he's doing expository preaching, what's he expounding? I'm more and more convinced that he basically has Psalm 110 as his big text, Psalm 110. And all the others actually are brought in to help explain that in one way or another. Either because there are puzzles in Psalm 110. So, for example, how can the Lord of David, someone who's bigger than David, i.e. the eternal Son, get promoted to be at God's right hand? Well, you need to go via Psalm 8, as in he came below the angels to go above them. Or how can you have a new kind of priest, a priest like Melchizedek? What does that mean for the law and the covenant and the priesthood and the tabernacle and the sacrifices? If you've got a new kind of priest, well, you need Jeremiah 31 to explain. There's a whole new covenant coming in. Does that make sense? So basically, all the passages, I think, are helping explain and unpack Psalm 110. You can go away and think about that if you want to. And if all of that was a blur, that's fine. That's fine. But let me pray now, and we're going to get into our real business today, this afternoon. So let me pray. Our Father in heaven, you've told us to consider your Son. And we confess that often our view of your Son is far, far smaller than he actually is. And that does mean we could be tempted to listen to other voices above him and tempted to rely on other things other than him. And we pray in our short time here that you would help us to begin to grasp more of how great he is and how much he's achieved. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we'll get back to do I really need to know about Melchizedek. I've said that it's all about Psalm 110. Let's just think a bit about the clearest structural marker of the book. So, as I said, there are lots of them, and people disagree quite how you put them together, and some of them are a bit confusing. But there are two that are really clear, and we're going to look at them now. So Hebrews 4, 14 to 16. So Hebrews 4, 14 to 16. And Hebrews 10, 19 to 23. Now, whatever structural gymnastics the commentary you're reading is doing, happily, they almost all notice that these are matching. These are pairs, very clearly pairs. So in our little twos and threes, do that exercise. So spot the matching ideas and phrases in those two chunks. I'll let you read it in your groups. So spot the matching ideas and phrases in those two chunks. And there's a lot of them, so don't stop after one or two. Okay, time's up. Time's up. Let's attempt some feedback live. Anyone willing to shout out something they saw that seemed to come up in both places? Hold fast. Yep, brilliant. Hold fast. And particularly hold fast our confession. Yeah, good. Good. Thank you. Any other things? Confidence. Yeah, good. Confidence in both. Drawing near, yeah, and those two things go together, don't they? So it's drawing near with confidence. Verse 16 of 4, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace. Verse 19, since we have confidence, ... 22, let us draw near with. So yeah, draw near with confidence. Hold fast your confession. Any other similarities? Jesus, yeah, good. Consider Jesus is the whole book. Yep, helpful. Good. Other things? High priest. Yeah, great. Great priest. So great high priest in 14 and great priest over the house of God, 21. Yeah, of 10, good. Any other things? Still some out there. Say the first bit again. Yeah, helpful. Yeah, so something about sin being cleaned or being free from sin, both him and us. Yep, really helpful parallel. Good. Any others?
Both are premise on previous events.
Helpful, yeah. Since, that's the since, isn't it? Since something led us, ... Does that make sense? Since we have. And it is striking, both times it's since we have. And I want you to hold that phrase. That will be important as we go on. It's not because there is, it's since we have. Does that make sense? It's not because Jesus is ... therefore ... It's since we have, let us ... let us ... Good. That's good. That's a good amount. There's one or two others, but that's fine. I overheard someone saying about the kind of passing through the heavens or entering the heavens. It's different language, but this idea that he's kind of gone through heaven and is now exalted at God's right hand. Good. Okay. So hopefully that's enough for you to think, hang on, these match. Like, these really match. These are matching brackets. You couldn't have made these sound more like each other if you tried. There's a since we have, and there's a double let us ... let us ... And actually the double let us is the same thing. So let us draw near with confidence, let us hold fast our confession twice. That's really solidly a pair. Does that make sense? Very clearly a pair. Good, and Jesus, as we said, same things. He's the great high priest. Now, what's striking is they're a pair, and they come around the section on him being the great high priest, and they bracket the section. What's even more striking than that, not on that picture, here we go. What's even more striking than that is the center of the book, 8 verse 1, where he says, this is my main point, is between those two things and shares some of the language. So 8 verse 1, it's there on the sheet. Now, the point in what we're saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who's seated at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. Do you see the brackets say, since we have such a great high priest, and the 8 verse 1 says, we have such a high priest. That sits right in the middle. Even more than that, when you look at the content, chapters 5 to 7, so up to 8 verse 1, 5 to 7, are all about one topic, which is how was the priest appointed, and then chapters 8 to 10 are all about the new covenant that he achieved. Which is where some of that work I was saying about key texts starts to come in. The key text for chapters 5 to 7 is how was he appointed? Psalm 110 verse 4, you're the priest like Melchizedek. And the key text for 8 to 10 is what's the new covenant he's brought in, Jeremiah 31. But all of that is about what kind of priest we have, the perfect priest we have. Does that make sense? Which is bracketed by, since, therefore, we have this great high priest. Let us do this, let us do this, let us do this. A couple of other things to note. Outside that is where you get those two great warnings. So don't be like the generation who hardened their heart. Do be like those who live by faith, which brackets this even more. Does that make sense? You've got your inner brackets of, since we have, let us, let us. And you've got your outer brackets of, don't harden your heart to Jesus like they did to Moses. Do live by faith like Abraham and the gang. And even more than that, there's a really stark warning right at the start of this section about not re-crucifying the Son of God. Like, when you know this Jesus and what he's like, whatever you do, don't re-crucify him. And there's a really stark warning. It's not actually exactly there in the flow of, it's slightly after that, but that's the place I could squeeze it in the diagram. A really stark warning about trampling the Son of God. Put all of that together, and I think it's really clear that this central section's being marked as the priest section. So since we have this priest, the great high priest, 8 verse 1, therefore let us do all these things. So over the page, that's why I do think this, of all the different approaches, and we're nearly finished on our structural sidebar if you're thinking this has been going on a while, of all the ways to look at the book, I think this kind of concentric way is the best. The center of it being the priesthood, and around the other sides of it, Jesus as speaker and Jesus as our brother. So that's now the full kind of layout of the book. But here's an important question. That's interesting, kind of, but I'm not a structure geek, so does this matter? Does it matter? Yes. Why does it matter? Because in a rich, heavy meal, which is chapters 5 to 10 of Hebrews, don't forget the lettuce. Okay? I know it's cheesy, but I mean, McDonald's know it. The Big Mac, it's a mouthful. Stick some lettuce in, it's brilliant. If that helps you remember, don't forget the lettuce. And there is a serious point here, rather than just a cheesy wordplay. These lettuces hold fast to the confession. Let us hold fast to our confession, and let us confidently draw near. At the start of the priesthood section and at the end of the priesthood section, give you the application for every talk or Bible study in chapters 5 to 10. Does that make sense? You know how I said the start of the book, we should be focusing our outbox on listening. It's all about listen to him. Don't harden your hearts. Don't drift away. Pay more close attention to what he said. Chapters 1 through to, really the end of, or halfway through 4. And now, the focus should be assurance. Let us draw near with confidence. And stickability to Jesus. Let us hold fast our confession. Everything we learn in chapters 5 to 10 should be helping us with those things. And as we preach it or teach it or lead Bible studies on it, it's great to come into land in these kind of areas. And again, I think that starts to help us with the fact that this isn't quite as kind of obscure and disconnected from life as we might initially think. Like you think, oh, priests, tabernacles, sacrifices, Melchizedek, that's all pretty weird. That's not the kind of stuff that comes up in pastoral conversations that I'm involved in. But the question is, does things like a lack of assurance come up in pastoral conversations we're involved in? Does struggling with sin come up in pastoral conversations we're involved in? Does a struggle to believe I'm forgiven and extend that to others? Does that come up? Does a battle to stick with Jesus publicly at work or with our neighbours or at school or uni, does that come up? Because if any of that comes up, well, the author of Hebrews thinks that this section is going to help us with that, strengthen us for that. Don't forget the lettuce. The other thing about the lettuce, it's corporate. So let us draw near with confidence. Let us hold fast our confession. Which is striking, isn't it? Because, again, if you're thinking about those things like battling sin, wanting assurance when I pray and approach God, I think if we were imagining kind of when am I battling those kind of things, usually it would be on our own, in our bedroom, in our beds, by ourselves. Actually, Hebrews says, let's do that together. Let us draw near with confidence. Let us hold fast the confession. And let us, there's a bonus lettuce at the back end, let us not get out of the habit of meeting together, but encourage each other all the more as we see the day approaching. So don't forget the lettuce. Okay, that's the extra one, 1024. That, by the way, 1024, there may be a matching lettuce in 411, but I'm not sure enough about it to put on the slide yet. So you can think about that. You can think about that. Possibly there's 3 lettuces either side, but that still needs work, so I'm not there yet on that. Next year, maybe, if you see a slide on that, it might have another lettuce. But let's get on to this question. Do I really need to know about Melchizedek? And just by the way, that picture, it's not a guy with a Mohican. It's not a crown. It's not my visual impression of Melchizedek. It's someone whose head is exploding. That's what I was trying to capture. As in, oh man, this is hard. This is like, my head's exploding. This sounds pretty tough. Now, interestingly, even before we get to Hebrews, I think the Bible is saying you need to know about Melchizedek. Why do I think that? Well, there's a clue in Genesis, because Melchizedek, he only appears, just Genesis 14, just appears and disappears. So it's brief, but he's greater than Abraham in Genesis 14, and he's the way that God's blessing comes to Abraham in Genesis 14. He's blessed through Melchizedek. So even there, he's a big deal, but then it all goes quiet, and you're like, what happened to Melchizedek? What was that guy about? Until you get to Psalm 110, which is like, was it the National Lottery advert that had like the big hand back in the day and said, it's you? John's nodding, clearly a lottery advert aficionado. It's you. Psalm 110 is like this one, this guy, the guy like Melchizedek. That's the one. He's the one. He's the one at God's right hand. He's the one who's going to judge the world. He'll bring justice to the nations. He's the one who's the great priest eternally. As in Psalm 110 was saying, there's one individual through whom all of God's plans revolve. The king, the priest, the judge, one guy. It's him, David's Lord. I assume that's partly why Jesus, when he was in the temple courts and all the religious experts were throwing questions at him left, right, and centre, said, have you read Psalm 110? Have you thought about who David is talking about? Like, who could be bigger than David? And have you, obviously implicitly he doesn't say this, but have you thought that might be me? And have you thought what you might be doing to the son, the king of Psalm 110? They don't get it. But so all that's to say, even before Hebrews, Psalm 110 said Melchizedek is a big deal. And there's one like him coming who will sit at God's right hand, who will be the eternal priest, who will judge the world. Let's just in our twos for a moment, just that box at the top of the next page, why might people in our churches be tempted to zone out for this section? So we've got a section all about priests, and particularly Melchizedek-like priest. Why might folk be tempted to zone out? And I think there's a few different reasons, but just in twos for 30 seconds, what sorts of reasons might mean people feel they want to zone out? Okay, let's come together. Alrighty. I don't know what you came up with. There's the relevance thing, isn't there, that I've already tackled, the kind of, has this got anything to do with daily life and my Christian life? It all sounds pretty kind of alien and foreign culturally. There's the complexity issue, like it just sounds complex, doesn't it? If only his name didn't have a Z in, it just sounds complex. Then he wouldn't, if it was, it wouldn't be the King of Righteousness, which is important, but it just sounds strange. There's the fact that priest isn't a category, especially in kind of Scottish culture on the whole, unless folk are in a kind of Catholic background or context. So priest is just quite an unfamiliar term, and it can feel quite samey. It's quite a long chunk, this chapters 5 to 10. Now, one of the things about the structure, let me just go back a step through the letters. There we go. One of the things about the structure is, it is striking that for us, chapters 5 to 10 is probably the bit we're least excited about, because we don't know what to do with it. We're not sure how priesthood is really that relevant to us. If you've done one-off talks or mini-series from Hebrews, I won't do a survey, but I wonder how many of us have done it in this middle bit, or how much have we done Hebrews 11, because that's amazing, or chapters 1 to 4, or Jesus versus angels, that kind of stuff. But actually, by putting it in the middle of the book, the author thinks this is the most exciting bit, the most important, the most central, the most kind of get your head around this and it will keep you going as a Christian. So we just need to kind of take a deep breath and think, we may be tempted to skip it, but Hebrews seems to think this is where we need our eyes and mind focused. The other thing I love about Hebrews, let's get through the letters now, is he's a really good preacher. So chapter 5, which is when this Melchizedek stuff starts to come to the fore. 5 verse 6, you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So 5 verse 6 brings in that bit of Psalm 110. And he allows himself to say the name one more time before he pauses and takes a time out. It's amazing. Look, so 1 verse 6, you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Then 5 verse 6, that was. 5 verse 10, I'll pick it up from 9. Being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. That's the second time he said it. And then he's like, I've got to pause. I'm starting to lose you. Verse 11. About this, we have much to say, and it's hard to explain. And the problem is not Melchizedek, like Melchizedek's not the problem. You're the problem, he's saying. I've never tried this, actually, from the pulpit. Like, it's not that the Bible's boring, it's that you're not interested. But that's what he's saying. He's saying, don't be lazy listeners. And actually, 5:11 to 6:12 is a little kind of pause the tape. I need you to listen to what's about to come. So striking that, isn't it? Just before the hardest bit, or the most alien bit of the book, chapters 5 to 10, he says, you really need to listen to this. And there's this striking thing that the way to keep going in the Christian life, remember the whole book's trying to keep us enduring, you have need of endurance. The way to keep going is to keep growing. So 5 verse 14. Solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. So what he's saying is, solid food is a good thing. Like babies are supposed to grow up from milk. Christians are supposed to grow up from Christianity Explored or Hope Explored, those 3 weeks. Grow up to a full, bigger view of Jesus. We're supposed to grow up. The way we grow up is practice. Do you notice that, verse 14? This isn't just about intellectual stuff. Verse 14, solid food is the mature. How do you become mature? Well, those who've had powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. It's as we put into practice walking with Jesus that we grow more of an appetite to learn more of him. And then there's 6 verse 1, which if you've done a series on Colossians, you feel like this is heresy. Therefore, let us leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity. Like, no, you mustn't leave Christ. But he's not talking about going from Christ to something else. He's saying from baby Christ, like a nursery school, elementary understanding of who Jesus is, to a grown-up, more grown-up view of Jesus. That's what he's saying. Or to put it another way, if you're going to endure big suffering for Jesus, you need a big view of Jesus. Does that make sense? Like if we're going to stand, you always get these kind of, the next decade's going to be really awful in Scotland or the UK. We don't know that for sure. But certainly the signs at the moment are it's getting increasingly uncomfortable to be a kind of Bible-centered Christian in this nation. If it's going to get harder, we need a bigger view of Jesus to keep us going, keep us gladly going. And so we need to get into some of the kind of real food, some of the Melchizedek stuff. The only way to keep going is to keep growing. I said earlier, right at the start of the morning, that Hebrews is a great book for aging congregations, for elderly congregations, because it's got that Hebrews 11 all the way to the end. Keep trusting the promises. I think this warning is a great thing more for the middle-aged type Christian. You know, the Christian who super keen at university, maybe got some training, maybe came to days like this, like super keen, eager, feed me. And then life got really busy, like work got more stressful, few promotions, kids came along, that was really busy, tiring, maybe health got a bit worse, harder to get to church, harder to get to small group. And they're kind of still going as a Christian, but they're running on fumes, basically running on the food that they were given when they were in their early 20s and not continuing to grow. And I think the author to the Hebrews would say, come on, let's keep going. As 6 verse 11 puts it, 6 verse 11. In another bit that says kind of, they've made a great start, but they need to keep going. 6 verse 11. We desire each one of you to show the same earnestness to have the full assurance of hope, there's assurance again, until the end, that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. So in a sense, keep going. How do you keep going? By keeping growing. I remember giving this talk, actually. We were on Zoom. I can't remember quite what happened, but that's right. We were moving into our new building, and then we weren't allowed in because of some health and safety hiccup. We were already out of our old building, so we were stuck. So we went on Zoom for one Sunday only, and I was giving the talk that week. We share around our preaching, but I was giving the talk. And you know, if you're preaching to a camera, it's just awful. It just feels awful. Like you've got no sense of, is anything going in? And, this is probably really dull, and etc. And then afterwards, text after text and message after message, conversation after conversation, people saying, I really needed to hear that. Do you know what? I haven't really thought about kind of growing in my knowledge of Jesus for years. Like I'm kind of just trying to stay alive, like just trying to hold on. But what he's saying in Hebrews is the way to hold on is to keep considering Jesus and growing your view of Jesus. All of which should whet our appetites for the rest of this session and the rest of Hebrews. So let's carry on. Sorry, I'm just working out if I have time to talk about why I put that final bullet point. Just on that thing of we might need to tackle some UK evangelical anti-intellectualism. What am I talking about? I think, understandably, many folk in our churches and actually many of us in ministry are a bit suspicious of kind of academic theology, because liberal theology has swept through lots of the institutions that teach theology, and the Bible itself has some critiques of, the wise and understanding whom God hides things from because they're too proud. Or 1 Corinthians 8, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Put all those verses together and we can start to think, like thinking really hard about Jesus isn't very spiritual. Kind of, it's not good to think too hard. Just trust, be like a little child and just receive the kingdom. Now, that's true in terms of humility. We should never be impressed with ourselves about what we know. We should never show off to others about what we know. And we're always saved by grace, which is a gift received by faith, like a little child. It's true of humility, but it shouldn't be true of hunger. As in, God gave us brains, and his Son is really big, like really, really, really big. And his word is really rich. Remember, described as like richer than fine gold, sweeter than the best honey. And so we should think hard about Scripture and listen well to Scripture, deeply, like chew on it. That's what the word consider means. Think hard, think carefully about Jesus. So as we go in, both for ourselves and perhaps for those we serve, we will need sometimes to say that this morning in our sermon we're going to do a bit of hard work, a bit of hard thinking. That's not an excuse to be complex or inaccessible. One of my prayers and aims both today and generally in preaching and teaching is that it's simple enough that someone could come in and only take away one thing, but it would be a good thing, like it would be a clear thing. So clarity is non-negotiable. Paul prays, help me to be clear that as I ought. But that's not the same as being shallow or superficial. It's not the same as just putting Christianity Explored on repeat every Sunday morning. That's not what Hebrews does. It gives us a deeper view of Jesus, because big view of Jesus means able to suffer in big ways for Jesus. Okay, more than enough pep talk. Let's get on to how the Son was appointed. So we've done our structural sidebar. We have talked about whether we need to know about Melchizedek. Yes, you do. And now we're getting on to how was the Son appointed as high priest. Now, I think one of the reasons we are not excited potentially about this priest section, especially as kind of Christians in the UK or Christians in the West, is because if you did like word association with the word priest, like if you know that thing where you say a word and tell me the first thing that comes to your mind, if you did that in lots of our congregations, you said, okay, I'm going to say priest, you tell me what comes to mind, you go like, priest, and they say, don't need one. Because of the Reformation, right? If I know one thing about priests, it's you shouldn't have a priest. You shouldn't call anyone a priest. That's why we call ourselves ministers or elders or pastors. We're not priests. And we've got that kind of Reformation thing sitting in our heads as if the Reformation said, you don't need a priest. That's not what the Reformation said. The Reformation said, you have a priest, and therefore don't let anyone else get in his way or kind of take over from him. Does that make sense? The Reformation wasn't saying you don't need a priest. The Reformation was saying Jesus is the priest, and so don't let anyone else be the mediator in the way of him. But somehow over kind of the course of history and what's kind of left in our minds, instead we just have this association of priest bad, or priest unnecessary, or priest, Catholic. No, Jesus is the priest, and we do need a priest. And that's one of the things I think that should strike us as we go through Hebrews 5 to 10 in churches. So let's have a little go at this exercise. Do you remember I said earlier on at some point that Hebrews is brilliant because it tells you the basics you need to know about the Old Testament without having actually to go and do an overview of Leviticus or a kind of a walk through Exodus. And this would be another example. So we're just beginning the priestly section, 4:14 to 5:5. And brilliantly, we're told what a priest's supposed to do, a high priest. What is a high priest? What do they do? We get told. So in our groups, just a little exercise, read 4:14 to 5:4 and fill in this kind of job advert for a high priest. So who can get the job and how do they get it? And also, what's the nature of the work? So what does a priest do towards God and towards people? Does that make sense? So who can get the job of priest, high priest? And what's the nature of the work towards God and towards people? I'll give you 5 minutes for that. So how can you get the job of being a high priest? It's too late now, actually. There already is one. But two things, two qualifications. One, human being. That's the only way you can represent the people, human being. Let me find the passage. Every high priest, 5 verse 1, every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God. You've got to be human, which is why he had to run across the playground. That's why he had to come below the angels to be our priest. And secondly, you must be appointed by God. Appointed by God. Every high priest chosen from among men is appointed. And verse 4, no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, as Aaron was. That single truth, if we understand it rightly, has absolutely extraordinary implications for a multicultural, pluralistic Scotland. You can only be the high priest if you're appointed by God. As in, a mediator between people and God has to be appointed from above, has to be drawn from below, as in a human being, has to be appointed from above. God has to choose who the high priest is. Aaron, in the first instance, Moses, then Aaron, then Jesus. God gets to choose. And so actually we can throw as many ladders and bridges and mediators as we want into that gap, but actually God has chosen who can represent humanity, and he's chosen that person already, and that person is Jesus. What's the nature of the work? Well, representing people, presenting sin offerings on our behalf. So if sinners are ever going to relate to a holy God, you need a mediator, a high priest, appointed by God. And what's his role towards people? Well, he sympathizes with our weaknesses. Okay, over the page. So what we've seen so far is that we as sinners need a priest. So actually that Reformation instinct or post-Reformation instinct that we have, priest, no thanks. Priest, don't need one. Priest, sounds dodgy. No, we need a priest, but obviously Jesus has got the job wonderfully. Next question. How was Jesus appointed for the job of priest? When did that happen? Well, you've guessed it, Psalm 110. That's what Psalm 110 is about. Psalm 110 is the moment when, like Aaron was given the nod back in Exodus to be the high priest, well, so in Psalm 110, this figure at God's right hand is given the nod on oath. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Now, there's some puzzling things. In chapter 5, should say 5, both those references under how was Jesus appointed for the job say 4, chapter 4, but they both should say 5. So that means that's 5, 5 to 6, 5, 7 to 10. There's this puzzling stuff in 5, 7 to 10 of Hebrews. where Jesus was made perfect. If you've ever done Bible studies in the Hebrews with someone, I imagine this is one of the questions that came up. 5 verse 9, in what sense can Jesus be made perfect? Being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. It's a bit like becoming greater than the angels. Like, in what sense can that be true? This being made perfect is being made perfect for the job of priest. That makes sense? He was already perfect in his being, perfect God. He was already perfect in his sinlessness, no sin in him at all. But what he wasn't perfect at was being a priest until he came down into our shoes, until the divine Son became the Adamic Son, as in came down to be a human being, and learnt obedience, as in lived a life as a human in our place. Only then could he be perfect for the job of priest. For a technical term, that's vocational perfection. A good person on that is David Peterson, is excellent. If you want any further reflection on perfectness, perfection, I think is the word for that. David Peterson, short Tyndale commentary, he's great on perfection, and basically said that's the best bit of the book is it's vocational perfection. It's Jesus being made perfect for the job. Okay, so that's how he was appointed. He was appointed from on high, from above, from God, and he was made perfect for the role as he became a human being and learnt through a life of obeying God as a human being. Okay, then we got our bit of a G up, wake up call, don't be lazy listeners. Then jump on to chapter 7, verse 1. Chapter 7, verse 1. And this is really where we get into the meat of Melchizedek. I'll fly through this quite quickly. Yep, I will. Here are some questions that came up when we were looking at Melchizedek in our groups over the course of last year. First up, was Melchizedek, back in Genesis 14, Jesus turning up early? So was it like a Christophany, as the official term, like the Christ coming down early, God the Son kind of appearing in history beforehand? Some people think it's hard to tell, and there's a bit of a debate about that. I think it's actually clear that he's not. So the original Melchizedek, Genesis 14, wasn't the Son of God, but looked like him. I'm pretty sure Hebrews says that, doesn't it? 7 verse 3. So talking about, I'll give us a warm-up. I'll read from verse 1. This Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. Melchi, king, righteousness, Zedek, Melchizedek, king of righteousness. And then he is also king of Salem, which is where he comes from, that is, king of peace. He's without father or mother or genealogy. Oh, that starts to sound like Jesus, hang on. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Oh, that sounds really like Jesus, the Son. But then listen to this. But resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. As he looked like the Son of God, he was resembling him. Same in 7 verse 15. 7 verse 15, now talking about Jesus, this becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. As in, Jesus was in the likeness. He looked like Melchizedek. He wasn't Melchizedek. He looked like him. Does that make sense? And actually, Psalm 110 says that. So when it says you're a priest in the order of Melchizedek or after the order of Melchizedek, order is like a line, a sequence. That makes sense? You can't have a sequence if there's one of you. You need at least two. Like, here's the first one, Melchizedek Mark 1, Genesis 14. And now here's the second one, Melchizedek Mark 2, after the order of, in the line of Melchizedek Mark 2 is Jesus. That makes sense? So it's not that Jesus turned up early, it's that God put into Scripture, Genesis 14, a portrait of the king priest to come. Amazing that, isn't it? God put a portrait of Jesus Christ, the eternal king priest, in Scripture in Genesis 14. And we know that that's the kind of thing God does, don't we? He also put the serpent crusher, Genesis 3:15, a seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, but be bruised. So someone who will defeat evil, but somehow take a blow from evil. Put that in Genesis 3:15. He put Joseph in Genesis, picture of Jesus, and so on. So we know that's the kind of thing God does. He knows the end from the beginning. But Melchizedek sat there, first book of the Bible, and sat there as a picture of the king to come, the ultimate priest. Which brings us to question 2. What's so special about Melchizedek, number 1, the Mark 1? Like, if you were to read Genesis really carefully, which is what Hebrews is doing, what would you notice? All sorts of interesting things, as it turns out. So here you go. He's the original priest in the Bible. So long before you get Moses, the kind of prototype mediator, both up and down, long before you get Aaron or the Levitical priests, first priest, you might say Adam's a kind of priest. That's understandable. I'm fine if you think that. But in terms of the guy who's called a priest to the Most High, Melchizedek's your man. So that's important. He's the only example of a king priest. So once you get into Israel, the priestly tribe and the royal tribe are separate. Levites and Judah for the kings. And actually they're kind of kept separate, not supposed to mix and match the roles. And yet here's a guy who's both, before you get to the separate roles. Here's another one. He is the what about his parents priest. As in, Genesis is really interested in family trees. You don't need to read much of Genesis to think, oh yeah, really, really interested in family trees, except for Melchizedek. No family tree. No, he's the offspring of so-and-so. Just nothing about his parents. Just appears out of the blue, which is what Hebrews is talking about. When it says 7 verse 3, he's without father or mother or genealogy, I don't think it's literally saying he didn't have a mum and dad. What it's saying is when you look in Scripture at what's recorded about Melchizedek, there's no parents. He just appears out of the blue. Not just no parents, though, but no passing on the baton, no son that he passes the job to, no line of descent, no the next priest in line after Melchizedek was this guy, and then this guy, and then this guy. He's just a one-off. He just appears. Nothing before him, nothing afterwards, just a one-off. And Hebrews is looking at that and saying, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Before we even got into all the kind of Levitical priest stuff and the tabernacle and everything like that, God put a placeholder of a different kind of priest, a king priest, who seemed to have no parents and no progeny, no handing on of the priesthood, but just, presumably it just lasts. Now, Melchizedek Mark 1, I don't think his priesthood lasts forever. I'm sure he died, but Genesis doesn't tell us that. Again, unusually, you get lots of other characters, and they died, and they died, and they died, and they died. Melchizedek, he's just a one-off, just sits there. And then Psalm 110 comes along and says, hey, you know that Melchizedek guy that you've probably forgotten about from Genesis? Well, there's going to be another one who looks like him and is an eternal priest, a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. What else shows he's a big deal? Well, he's greater than Abraham, so Abraham pays him money. God's blessing, Genesis is all about God's blessing coming to the world through Abraham. Well, actually, there's someone between God and Abraham in Genesis 14, this guy, the Melchizedek priest. God's blessing comes to Abraham through this king priest, Melchizedek, this guy. Amazing. Which is obviously how it works in the end, that it's through Jesus that the blessing comes to Abraham's family, the family of faith. And there's some other cool stuff, like his name means King of Righteousness, his name means King of Peace, he rules in Jerusalem, he brings out bread and wine. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? Amazing. But here's the thing, all of that is just to start us thinking about how remarkable Jesus, the Son, is. He's Melchizedek Mark II, the one after the order of Melchizedek. He has all the stuff that we've just talked about that was true of Melchizedek, but in a bigger way. So it's not just he doesn't have parents, it's that he was incarnate, the divine Son coming into the world. It's not just his parents weren't mentioned, it's that he's come from above. And it's not just that his sons weren't mentioned, it's that he is an eternal priest, so there's no passing on of the baton. He's, as Psalm 110, he's eternal. Now, of course, to be eternal, to be an eternal priest, you have to have resurrection life. As in human beings, remember that one of the qualifications to be a priest is you've got to be human, and humans die. But Melchizedek Mark II, according to Psalm 110, is going to be an eternal priest, as in somehow he will have fixed the death problem for himself and then in time for others. He's a resurrected priest, an indestructible life, as chapter 7 puts it. And then best of all, and this is really kind of what gets a lot of airtime in chapters 5 to 7, is how he was appointed. So if you were a Levitical priest, the way you got the job was your dad was a Levitical priest and it got passed down. You were in the tribe and you were in the line of Aaron or whatever and you got the job passed down. You got it by bodily descent, as chapter 7 puts it. Verse 16, sorry, let me just find the verse. So Jesus became a priest, 7 verse 16, not on the basis of legal requirement concerning bodily descent, as in the Old Testament law, saying that it's the sons of Aaron or the sons of Levi that are the priests. No, Jesus, this is great, he became a priest, not by that route, the old inherit from your dad according to the law, but by the power of an indestructible life. So because Jesus was resurrected from the dead, he alone is qualified to be this Melchizedek-like priest, this one-off priest. And then, verse 20, the other thing is that it was not without an oath. Those who formerly became priests, like the Levi priests, they didn't get an oath. They just had to follow the law as it was laid out, that the sons become priests. But verse 21 of chapter 7, this one, Jesus, the Son, was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You're a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Let me put up a picture. God doesn't actually make many oaths in the Bible. When God goes on record and says, I swear this is going to happen, it's a big deal. So, for example, he says to Abraham, the kind of climax of the Abraham story, surely I'll bless you, I'll multiply you. And of Abraham, hang on, let me go back. And he says of Jesus, you're a priest forever. Now, with Abraham, as soon as God says, I promise to bless you, you could trust that promise because he never lies. Does that make sense? It's in God's character. He can't lie. It's impossible for God to lie. So you could trust him just on that basis. But then he swears an oath to Abraham. By myself I've sworn, declares the Lord. I'll bless you, I'll multiply you. Does that make sense? Big moment. And from then on, the whole of the Bible story keeps its eyes on Abraham and his family because God's sworn on oath. Psalm 110 says, not just God never lies, so if he says you're a priest forever, he means it, but God goes on oath. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Or in other words, Melchizedek, to be the Melchizedek-like priest is not like being a football manager. No football managers sacked tomorrow, he'll be sacked in the morning, all those songs. He just won't be. This role is a permanent appointment. And it's secure, it's like doubly secure. So the one who's in authority to hand out the job is committed. Like the boss isn't going to change his mind. The Father has said, you are a priest forever. So from above, he's not going to get the sack. And then from below, if you like, he's not going to retire or get injured or kind of die or age. He's eternal, resurrection life. Same sense. He's utterly secure, appointed from above and indestructible himself. Resurrected, which does mean the Son at the right hand of God, and this is the end of chapter 6, this little bit which compares the two, he is like the guarantee of our hope. Just look at 6 verse 19. 6 verse 19. I'll pick it up from verse 18, 6 verse 18. By two unchangeable things in which it's impossible for God to lie, so that's his promise and his oath, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast. Do you remember? Let us hold fast our confession. To hold fast to the hope set before us. And then here's Jesus' role in it all. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. There's the entry that we heard in the brackets, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. As in, he anchors our access to heaven. And we'll think into God's presence. We'll think more about that after the break. And the break is about to happen if you're feeling, I need a head breather. But just final thing. That's the theology, that the Son is securely appointed. He's been declared by oath from above, and he himself is indestructible, as it were, from below. He's not going to retire or get hurt or be absent from duty. And so final application, what's the kind of impact of all that? Well, all the things we saw in the lettuces. Remember, in a heavy meal, don't forget the lettuce. Don't forget the lettuce. So we had those hold fast to confession, confidently draw near. And actually those things are sprinkled through this section. So just look with me, 7 verse 17. I'll pick it up from there. For it's witnessed of the Son, you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. On the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. That's the old priesthood, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced. Listen to this. Through which we draw near to God. That's what Jesus is, the one who can help us confidently draw near, because he's been put in place. And likewise, 23 to 25. This was actually one of the most moving things I was struck by as we went through Hebrews as a church family. Partly because I thought Jesus' priestly work was all in the past. My vague memory of Hebrews was Jesus did his priestly work and then he sat down. And because he sat down, it's kind of job done. And some of it's done, as we'll see in the next section. But actually, just listen to this. Verse 23 of chapter 7. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So if you had a really good priest one year, it was sad because he wouldn't last. They wouldn't last. And the next one might be terrible. But Jesus holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he's able to save to the uttermost, or save to the end, all those who draw near to God through him. Let's draw near again. Since he always lives to make intercession for them. He always lives to make intercession for us. While we've been doing these sessions today, Jesus lives at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us. If, like me, you sometimes look ahead to a life of being a Christian in our culture, for however many years the Lord gives you, being in ministry in our culture, I'm thinking that's pretty daunting, pretty scary. Jesus always lives to make intercession for us, all the way to the end. He'll be there at God's right hand. And so what does that mean in practice? Well, I've put a few things in the box. You can ponder at them at your own leisure. But I said earlier, pluralism. If God has chosen his priests, it doesn't matter what we prefer, our different spiritual ways of approaching God. The reality is he's chosen, and he's got one choice, and it's Jesus, the eternal priest. This is top of page 18. So hold fast your confession of Jesus. I think, as I've just been talking about, valuing Jesus' current work, not just his past work, so full assurance because of that. And if we're feeling daunted, hopefully this consideration of Jesus will help us. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Let me close this in prayer for the moment. I was going to give you a little mini sermon from Hebrews 7, but we're out of time, so you can find it on YouTube if you want to. But let me pray. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we do thank you for your Son, conscious that were he not in place at your right hand as our eternal priest, we couldn't even safely pray like this with confidence. I do pray you'd help us to reflect on these things, to absorb them, and most of all, to draw near to you with confidence and to hold fast our confession of Jesus, knowing that he's the one you've appointed eternally to be the priest. Pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.